to prove the theory of reconstructive memory, Bartlett did a study which he called War of the Ghosts in the year 1932. Its aim was to see if people alter the information in an unfamiliar story so that it makes more sense to them. And as we recalled in the previous video, that sometimes when you say a confusing story to someone from a different culture who might not know the language well, who might not know what the story is talking about well, who's not familiar with things like ghosts, for example, like demons, like whatever the story is talking about, they might change it to make it more familiar to them. The method he used was each participant is asked to read War of the Ghosts. So he wrote a participant and he asked the participant to read War of the Ghosts twice to themselves. Then they would recall the story to another person, and that third person to recall it to a fourth person. All right. A record was made by Bartlett to note the changes made from one person to another. He took down notes to see the changes. And the result was as follows. The passages became much shorter. There were lots of omissions. Details had changed. The order of events had changed. All mention of ghosts disappeared. Unfamiliar names were changed into familiar ones. The final version was a clear story of a fight and death. So the whole story changed. Okay. Conclusion. Bartlett concluded that our memory is not an exact copy of what we hear. It is distorted by what we already know. Therefore, memory is influenced by beliefs and stereotypes. Okay. Each one of those people who heard the story tried to make sense of it. So they altered a little bit of the story until the story was entirely gone. Okay. Now, the evaluation here, we have positives and negatives. As for the positives, is that before Bartlett's research, memory has been tested by meaningless materials like nonsense word lists, like the ones, for example, Murdoch used. Okay. Using a story made the study more relevant to how memory is used in everyday life, because we tend to tell stories on a daily basis. Okay, not necessarily like the War of the Ghosts, but if an event happened, if an incident took place between two of my friends, and I want to tell that incident to a fourth friend, I would tell it in the form of a story. And then limitations of this study. And then number 3, other psychologists have since replicated Bartlett's study and they found a similar outcome. The limitations. Now, many people disagree that Bartlett's study tested memory in a meaningful way, arguing that the story is deliberately confusing and unfamiliar. They said, like, this very confusing story cannot be there in everyday life. Yeah, you did not do it in a laboratory, so it does not lack ecological validity. Yes, yet, if we thought about it, if we give it more thought, we'll find that this does not happen in everyday life. We do not move around telling each other confusing stories. Number 2 is Bartlett recorded each recalling of the story to see how they differ. But written data are very difficult to score. You cannot put that on a graph. The third one is that Bartlett used students who were studying English at Cambridge University. Some psychologists argued that participants were likely better at reading and verbalizing than those not studying English. So he actually did not do it randomly. He chose his participants. And this would affect the ecological validity of the experiment. Now, there is another exam tip here. If you're being asked to define effort after meaning, try to give an example, which is the one we talked about in the previous video. All right. So always remember, definition means you define and give example. Definition means you define and give example. All right.